Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to another episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode I call Unidentified Submersible Objects, 5 USO Cases with High Strangeness. I've investigated many cases of USOs. These objects are not only flying around in our skies, but also in our oceans, and for that matter, in our lakes and rivers. And I think it's important people know that. That's why I wanted to do this video. And I've picked 5 cases that I think have something unique or interesting to contribute to our understanding of this phenomenon. So let's just dive right in. First case I want to talk about, I call a USO in Lake Hamilton. Lake Hamilton is a rather large lake. It's located just outside of Hot Springs, Arkansas. And this case occurred in 1952 to a gentleman I'll just call Mark. That's not his real name, but he does not want to be identified, and so I used a pseudonym. So if his friend hadn't begged him, Mark would never have gone to the lake on this one summer night. But he did go, and his life would never be the same. Mark was about 16 years old at the time, and his friend Randy, that's also a pseudonym, was practically begging him to go to Lake Hamilton with him. On this particular night, Randy had a problem. He was dating a girl, Tina, and had asked her if she would go with him on her family's 16-foot speedboat to cruise the lake. She agreed, but only on one condition, that she could bring along her friend Natalie, and that Randy brought a friend along so that they could sort of have a double date. Randy immediately agreed and turned to his friend Mark to come along on the date and join them on the speedboat. Mark, however, wasn't really interested in Natalie as a girlfriend, but after much persuasion by Randy, he finally agreed, and only on one condition. That he could drive the boat. So Randy and his girlfriend Tina agreed because they wanted to be alone in the back of the boat anyway. And so it was around 7 p.m. that Mark and Randy's girlfriend Tina, and her friend Natalie all boarded the 16-foot ski boat and pulled away from the dock. And for the next hour, they cruised around Lake Hamilton. It's about a 10-mile wide lake with many little sort of inlets. And finally, at around 8 p.m., it started to get dark, and Mark pulled up to the middle of a large isolated bay. They were about 50 yards or so from the shore and still in a deeper section of the lake. They cut off the motor to the boat, and as far as they could tell, they were totally alone on the lake. They certainly couldn't see any other boats. So Randy and Tina were in the back of the boat, and now that it was dark and quiet, they kind of curled towards each other and began smooching. And meanwhile, Mark and Natalie did their best to ignore them and kind of talked awkwardly about trivial subjects. And less than 5 minutes passed before something very strange happened. As Mark says, and I quote, "You know how a submarine makes a gurgling sound like in the movies? Well, we started to hear this gurgling sound, and it was pretty loud." Natalie asked, "What is that noise?" Mark said, "I don't know," and started looking around for the source of this noise. Randy and Tina, who were in the back of the boat, peeled themselves off of each other and began looking around for the source of this noise. Natalie kept repeating, "What is that? What is that noise?" And Mark could see that she and Tina were both starting to get kind of scared. And Mark just kept saying, I don't know what it is. They were all looking for the source of this noise, which was getting louder and louder. Suddenly, they discovered what the source of this noise was, and they could hardly believe their eyes. As Mark says, all of a sudden, right beside the boat, something started coming out of the lake. It started coming up and it broke the water. I could see that it was black and it was round. It was probably 25 to 30 feet in diameter. There were no lights, and I heard no noise but this gurgling noise. and it came up right next to the boat. I could have reached out and touched it. At this point, the girls started screaming, "What is it? What is it?" And Mark and his friend Randy just stared at this black object, trying to figure out what it could possibly be. Mark's first thought was that it might be a sunken boat dock that had just spontaneously risen from the bottom of the lake. At that time, boat docks were sometimes constructed using 55-gallon barrels tied together with boards nailed over them. But it was pretty clear to him that this was not a boat dock. As he says, "It looked to me like a black saucer. It was tapered in the middle. It went up a little bit higher. This object rose about 3, maybe 4 feet out of the water and was easily twice the size of their boat." And up until this point, Mark wasn't feeling any fear, but the girls were very terrified and were screaming, "Let's get out of here! Get out of here! Let's get out of here!" And Randy was also screaming at Mark to start the boat. So Mark didn't hesitate any longer. He turned on the ignition and jammed the accelerator at a high speed, and to his shock, the boat would not move. It was only then that he started to feel a little fear. As he says, "I started the boat and I jammed it wide open. It just sat there and it wouldn't go, like something was holding it. It just felt like it was tied to a dock." So at this point, the boat engine was revved at full blast and the boat just would not move. All 4 of them were screaming. And at this point, something weird happened. There was a shift. They became disoriented. They lost track of time. And as Mark says, "The next thing I remember, we were about 200, maybe 300 yards down the lake, going 50 miles per hour. The boat was porpoising like crazy, and everybody was still screaming." Mark says all of them were, quote, "scared to death." The boat was heading straight for a pole sticking up out of the water. Mark swerved the boat and stopped, and everyone slowly stopped screaming and tried to gather their wits. None of them had any idea what had just happened. Mark steered the boat towards his girlfriend's house, or, towards Natalie's house, where the dock was, and it took them about 15 minutes to return and pull the boat into its little stall there. They went inside and got another shock. It was now already after midnight. Tina's parents were absolutely furious. They screamed at the boys to get out of the boat, get into the house, and ushered the girls into the bedroom. The parents were not interested in hearing any explanation, neither from the boys or the girls. They told the boys, "Leave now, or we are going to call the police." So Mark and Randy didn't need any convincing, and they just went straight home. Following this incident, the subject kind of became taboo. None of them wanted to talk about it. Mark tried to tell a few adults, but each of them just kind of laughed him off, thought he was just a teenage boy messing around with girls. And so he put the experience behind him and lived his life. He wanted to talk about it, but strangely he wasn't able to, because shortly following this incident, Randy and the 2 other girls all moved out of town. And as the years passed, Mark often thought about this incident. I was particularly puzzled by this missing time aspect, and estimates that they lost about 4 hours of time while they were on this Lake Hamilton. It was about 20 years later, in the early 1970s, that Mark was in the local department store when he was shocked to come upon his old best friend, Randy. And after saying hello and talking a little bit, Randy actually brought it up. He says, "Do you remember that thing we saw coming out of Lake Hamilton that night?" And Mark says, "Yeah, I do remember it." And Randy nodded, and the conversation moved on. There didn't seem to be much else to say. And it was just a few years later that Randy, unfortunately, tragically, contracted cancer and passed away. So Mark had lost a good friend and one of the few people who might be able to answer what happened on that night. And it was following that his curiosity continued to consume him, and he thought he's going to try and contact these other two witnesses. And it was in 1975 that Mark heard about the two men in Pascagoula, Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker, who had an experience while fishing where a UFO landed right next to them, and they also experienced missing time. They recalled being taken on board the craft, and Mark really began to wonder, did this happen to him? And if so, what did the aliens do? As Mark says, I remember the fishermen in Mississippi. That kind of made me think, but I can't remember a thing of what happened. I've tried and tried, but there's a blank there. Nothing. It's just strange that something could happen like that, and there's nothing to explain anything. The memory loss is really the thing to me because I can't remember anything about it. It's just a blank. I don't know what happened in those hours. It's like they didn't exist. Like you have an operation and you can't remember anything. And it just happened that quickly. I've heard they can make you forget everything if you're captured by one. Well, something sure happened. So Mark started to read about UFOs. At that time, there wasn't a whole lot written on the subject, but by the 1990s, there was. And Mark learned that a lot of people had this kind of experience and used hypnosis to recover their memories. And he started seriously thinking about going under hypnosis. He also learned that people have strange marks on their body. He didn't notice anything like that. However, he read that many people who are experiencers have sinus problems, and that's certainly true for him. As he says, I've had 2 complete sinus operations. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. I wish I could remember something. In 2002, Mark retired, and he decided he would try to search for the other 2 witnesses. He was easily able to locate one of them, as he knew she was a nursing student. And like Mark, she was now in her late 60s. Mark introduced himself. She remembered him clearly. And Mark asked her about that night on the lake. And all she remembered was that they came in very late and her parents were, quote, awful mad. Mark reminded her about the weird gurgling sound they heard, and the black saucer-like object, them screaming and suddenly missing 4 hours of time. And she told him, quote, I don't remember anything on the lake. I don't remember anything about that. So that upset Mark. He wasn't able to locate the other witness. He's still considering hypnosis. The only thing that's really stopping him are finances. And also, as he says, I'm kind of embarrassed to mention it in front of anybody. Nobody believes me, so I don't say much about it. He still lives in this area, not far from Lake Hamilton, but he never went back to that spot. As he says, I'm going to start fishing in this lake at night this summer. I'll be fishing right where it happened. I'm a little leery about going back to this place at night by myself. I don't know if I'll go back. I don't know. So yes, this is a very strange USO encounter, and one of very few cases that I've investigated, and really very few that I actually have ever read about, in which someone has experienced an apparent abduction by a USO. While he doesn't remember actually going on board, it's pretty clear from the missing time that there's more to this experience than he recalls. So yeah, that's the first case I wanted to share with you. And now let's move to the second case, which is equally strange. And I call this USO Encounter on Lake Miccosukee. Lake Miccosukee is located very close to Monticello, Florida. And the main witness in this case is a gentleman by the name of Wade Bentley. And this incident occurred in the fall of 2007 when Wade and his girlfriend decided to take his Minn Kota kayak out on the lake. This is a pretty large lake, 17,500 acres. It's located in Jefferson County, and it's a large, swampy prairie lake, not very deep. It's often filled with lily pads covering a large part of the surface. So they are out there on this evening in the fall of 2007, just watching the stars and enjoying the solitude. There was only one other boat within view. It was several hundred yards away from them. They could see that the only person on that other boat was an old black man who was fishing for perch. He was about 300 yards to the southwest. And at this point, they saw something very strange. It looked, at first, they thought it was a helicopter coming west over the lake, sending down a beam of light, like a searchlight. But as they watched, this searchlight suddenly shined towards their direction, dropped down to the level of the water, and started heading north. Now at this point, this light was several miles away when, without warning, it darted towards the old man's boat and dove into the water, disappearing beneath it. Wade and his girlfriend were completely shocked. Strangely, the old man didn't react at all and just kept on fishing. And as they were discussing what had just happened, they could see that this light was moving. As Wade says, the light, now underwater, took off southeast just to the point of Pine Island, 3 miles away, then popped up like a periscope, shining the brightest and tightest spotlight I have ever seen. By now, we were praying, and that light focused on us. I was holding my breath as it dropped underwater, and in 3 seconds, it rushed at us and disappeared under our boat. We were calling on Jesus at this point. All of this happened in about 30 seconds. At this point, Wade became somewhat confused and disoriented, as did his girlfriend, because suddenly this USO and the fishing boat with the old man in it were both gone. And as Wade says, the old man had disappeared, and now a bass boat with 2 men nearly rammed us, literally out of nowhere. I pulled a .357, a Magnum revolver, on them, hammer back, face to face, and screamed for them to back off. They did not see us or react whatsoever. They just faded off. So that was really strange, and Wade and his girlfriend were very confused and very concerned. They headed immediately for shore and were physically shaking as they docked their kayak. So they have no explanation for how this fisherman, who was right near them, disappeared, and how this other boat suddenly appeared right next to them and actually nearly rammed their boat while still failing to even see them. So this was very strange. This was not Wade's first UFO experience. Throughout the month of August 1988, he and many other people in the area were observing multiple UFOs on a nearly nightly basis. These objects were sometimes dozens in number, appeared very much like the object he and his girlfriend had seen on the lake. But that was years earlier. Regarding this 2007 encounter, Wade remains convinced that it was a genuine USO. As he says, and I quote, 90% of this lake is less than 5 feet deep and covered in lily pads. I don't see how an object with a physical body can move at these speeds above and below the surface and through thick aquatic foliage, much less with no sound whatsoever. It was moving a mile or more per second, and it seemed to have an intelligence about it. When I spoke of it, It shined our way and came not once but twice. There is no doubt in my mind, my heart and soul and spirit, that it was being intelligently controlled or driven. So it sounds to me like Wade and his girlfriend probably had missing time, just judging from the fact that they were directly targeted by this UFO, this USO. It shined a beam of light on them. The black man in the boat disappeared, and there was another boat there. They had some disorientation with time. These are all red flags pointing towards the strong probability, I think, that there's more to this experience than they can consciously recall. Hard to say, but it is what it is. It's a very strange encounter, and I wanted to include it because it shows how these objects are able to maneuver at very high speeds, not only in the sky, but underwater and in very shallow water for that matter. They must have some sort of force field that allows them to move in and out of the water. Hard to say, but definitely a very interesting case. Another case I'd like to talk to you about, I call a USO in the Bahamas. This gentleman, who I will call Dean, he doesn't want his real name used, contacted me because of my research into USOs. There's not a lot of information out there, and so he wanted to talk to someone who might have some information that could explain what he saw while he was out boating with his wife. They had actually decided to take their boat, he's an avid sailor, from their home in Jacksonville, Florida, to the Abacos Islands in the Bahamas. And I'd actually just like to let Dean tell his story in his own words, because he gave a really lucid interview, and it's really quite an interesting encounter. This is actually very near or part of the Bermuda Triangle. So that might be significant because this is an area of very high levels of strangeness and UFO, USO activity. So I'll just let Dean describe in his own words what happened. This is Dean talking. In August of 1984, after completing a month-long cruise in the Abacos Islands of the Bahamas, we were on our 30-foot sailboat sailing from Walker Cay, Bahamas, to Jacksonville, Florida. We were about 19 miles off of Daytona, Florida. I was at the helm, and my wife was sitting up with me in the cockpit, keeping me company. Seas were calm with a light breeze, there was no moon, and the water was extremely clear. I would estimate there was at least 100 feet visibility. We were on a course of 310 degrees at about 3 knots. At about 1 a.m., I noticed a green-colored beam of light sweeping under the water, under the boat, from right to left. This was followed by another and another sweep of light under the water at regular intervals. This went on for a while, and the beams kept sweeping under the boat. As time went on, the beams grew stronger and more well-defined, and after about 15 minutes after we first noticed the light beams on the water, a large green object passed directly under our boat on a course of about 300 degrees. The object was round, about 100 to 150 feet in diameter, and had spokes of green light radiating from it, rotating counterclockwise, and bright lights around the mid-diameter. After the object passed under the boat, we saw the beams of light, now sweeping from left to right, for at least 20 minutes before we could no longer make them out. There is no way I can tell you what we saw, but it was real. I have seen submarines, and I can tell you this was not a sub. Dean felt like this object was actually targeting his boat because it came right for them and actually passed directly underneath their boat at a slight angle, traveling at about 15 knots which is, 3 times their own speed. And as Dean says, by the laws of chance, for it to go directly under my boat, it's pretty thin. I feel like it came by to take a look. Neither he nor his wife felt any fear during this incident. They were mostly curious. There was no apparent effect on their boat. This object, they estimate, was just 100 feet below them. They did have a depth finder, but they didn't want to go down below to look at it and miss the view of this fantastic object. As Dean says, this thing was vastly bigger than my boat, and it had an inner ring of lights shining, but the outer ring had spokes of lights, and it was all one kind of green hue. When it went under my boat, it had spokes radiating in all directions. I didn't count them, but I was in awe of this situation. And it was these strange beams of light that impressed him the most, because they seemed to stretch for hundreds of feet underwater. As Dean does not think that this was any type of phosphorescent fish or jellyfish, it clearly wasn't. He has seen phosphorescent fish on many occasions. As he says, the waters in that area are teeming with light-emitting plankton. I've always thought the energy emitted by the object was disturbing the plankton, and perhaps that was the cause of the light spokes. But he's certain that the plankton itself was not the cause of the object itself. As Dean says, the round object had a brighter glow than I think could have been achieved by plankton, and this circular array of lights was definitely not plankton. So he can only speculate what he and his wife saw. It was clearly a structured object. They heard no sound. It didn't affect their boat in any way. They did not have missing time that they're aware of. But they are absolutely convinced this was not anything normal, not a submarine or any kind of conventional sea craft. It was a USO, a very strange case. And that's why I wanted to include it here. And now let's move to case number 4, which I call a USO off the coast of Mendocino. This is a very interesting case because it's one of very few cases I've researched in which the witnesses observed the object coming down out of the sky and into the water, and then coming out of the water and into the sky. So clearly not a plane and clearly not a submarine. We do not have any flying submarines, officially at least. And as you hear this gentleman's account, it's clear that he did not see a submarine or a flying submarine. This took place again off the coast of Mendocino, which is in Northern California. And it occurred on the evening of July 9th, 1981. I call the witness Davy. That's not his real name. But Davy and his wife were staying in a hotel located along the bay. This is at Fort Bragg, actually. And they were walking outside the hotel, watching the coast, when they saw something amazing. As Davy told me, and I quote, "It was dusk as we watched a large green fluorescent orb, 15 to 20 feet in diameter, come from the east over land out over the bay and slowly descend into the water. We just thought, weird." And they continued their walk, and to their shock, they actually saw this thing exit the water just a short time later. As the witness says, about 10 to 15 minutes later, we were just about to go back into the hotel when this same craft came up out of the water and steadily rose back upward and eastward until out of sight. At this point, all the hair on my body stood up. So that's a significant detail. These craft do sometimes emit some sort of perhaps gravitational or electric or magnetic field around them. And This witness, Davy, could actually feel the effect of this field on his skin. It made all his hair stand on end. So this is a very interesting case for a couple of reasons. Yeah, an object going into the water, scooting around, doing whatever it's doing down there, and then coming out and flying off. Clearly not a normal object. It's a brief case, but a very unusual case, which is why I wanted to include it here. So these 4 cases I presented in my book, Undersea UFO Base, an in-depth investigation into USO activity in the Santa Catalina Channel. As I said, I've investigated a lot of cases involving USOs, and I've presented most of them in that book, including these 4 cases. But this next case that I want to talk about is really why I wanted to do this video. It's one of the most unusual USO cases I've ever heard in my life. I've never heard of anything like this before or since. This case is presented in my new book, Wondrous 25 True UFO Encounters. And I think it deserves to be widely known because it's, wow, what a strange case. I call this case USO Encounter at Moss Landing. The main witness is Joy Williams, and at the time of this incident, she was 45 years old. It was a warm August evening in 1997, and Joy and her husband Tom had decided to have dinner with their friend Emily. That's a pseudonym, but Joy and Tom did allow their real names to be used. So their friend Emily had this beautiful home that overlooked Monterey Bay in California. This is where Moss Landing is. The home is actually located in Aptos, which is about a quarter mile from the bay, and it's perched high in the hills and affords a fantastic view of the bay. So they ate dinner that evening, and afterwards, Joy decided to step out onto the veranda to enjoy the fresh air and the beautiful view. Everything looked normal. She was just looking at the ocean, and she noticed this weird, bright, yellow-green glow in the water, maybe a quarter mile offshore. It was well inside the northern edge of the bay. And for the next few minutes, this glow slowly brightened, and then to Joy's utter amazement, this gigantic egg-shaped object began to rise from the water. As Joy says, it was huge. It was really big. And as it was coming out, I could see all the kelp slipping off of it. It rose out slowly. Joy immediately called for her husband, Tom, and her friend, Emily, to look at this, and all 3 of them watched it in amazement. It was immediately apparent to all of them that this was something very unusual. Joy herself was actually a military brat, had grown up on military bases, and was quite familiar with all kinds of strange aircraft, and she had never seen anything like this. As she says, we were staring at it with our jaws slack, and then it started to move. At this point, the conversation between them became pretty animated. They kept asking, what is it? What could this be? There was no sound that they could hear. The object was a good half-mile away, but if it was a plane, they should have been able to hear it. This object, after rising upwards out of the water, moved slowly north, sort of skirting the shoreline, and it appeared to be following a very deliberate path. Emily, at this point, remembered that she had a telescope. It's already set up right there on the veranda. So they quickly rushed to the telescope and looked at this thing. Joy was the first. And as Joy says, and I quote, "When we looked at it through the spyglass, we could see portholes all around the center of it." Joy estimates that there was about a dozen visible portholes, all of them elliptically shaped, and they were alternating green and amber in color. So as they watched it, this object continued moving slowly towards the north. It took about 20 minutes while this object just sort of moved lazily along, and it was heading directly for the Moss Landing coal power plant. And after about 20 minutes, this object stopped right next to the smokestacks of this power plant at Moss Landing. This object was so close to the smokestacks that the light from this object actually illuminated the smokestacks themselves. Now we know that these smokestacks rise about 500 feet, and this object was hovering immediately next to the openings of these smokestacks, and so they knew that this object had to be at least 50 feet across. So by this point, they were absolutely convinced that they were seeing a genuine UFO or USO. Tom seemed to take the experience in stride. Joy herself, she felt slightly nervous and wondered if the occupants of this object realized that they were being observed. And Emily, actually, who owned the home, was the most upset of the three of them. As Joy says, "It was a little scary, to be honest. It disturbed me. It's a hard emotion to express. It made me feel like I wasn't in control, a bit intimidated, because I almost felt like it knew I was watching it." And here's where things went from strange to absolutely bizarre. What happened next left them all stunned. This gigantic metallic arm emerged from the side of the craft farthest from the smokestacks. This arm extended over, then bent upwards over the craft itself, and then bent downwards. It was hinged, and the end of this arm contained a giant pair of pincers, which now began to dig inside the opening of the smokestacks. As Joy says, "I don't know what it was doing, but it had these long pincers on it, and it looked like it was collecting something. It was just hovering right next to the power plant, and it did that for about 20 minutes. We couldn't stop looking at it because it was just so bizarre. We were stunned, like, what is this thing?" They continued to talk excitedly among themselves. This area was fairly well populated, and they thought to themselves, other people should be seeing this. This is going to be front page news. Of course, it wasn't. They checked the newspapers the next day. There was nothing in the papers about this. But this craft was huge and quite bright, and at the time they thought for sure they were not the only witnesses. I think there probably were other witnesses, but nobody perhaps reported it. But the strangest thing about this thing was this weird metallic arm. For one thing, why was it coming out of the far end of the object? That was weird. The arm itself extended practically twice the length of the craft, and the pincers alone had to be at least 20 feet long. Tom also saw all of this clearly, as Tom says in his own words, "My first memory of seeing this thing hovering in the sky was between us and the power plant. I didn't see it come out of the water. It had an arm on it and several lights. There was a telescope, and once we had a good look at it, we saw this definite arm and a couple of different colored lights. The thing itself was kind of a golden yellow color, and it hovered in the sky for quite some time. Finally, I called the police." At first, the officer was very receptive and friendly, and he listened to both Joy and Tom describe what they were seeing. And the moment it became clear, however, that they were describing an apparent UFO, the officer's attitude changed 180 degrees. It was like a switch being turned off, they said. This officer now began to dismiss their testimonies completely and told them, quote, "It's probably just a fishing boat." Tom said, "In the middle of the sky?" And Joy, who was on the other line, said, "Fishing boats don't fly. This definitely came up out of the water." And they told him that the object was still there, right next to the smokestacks at Moss Landing. But the officer absolutely refused to listen. As Joy says, it didn't seem to make any difference to him. And as Tom says, he said it was probably this or that. We didn't get much help. So this officer was not the least bit receptive, and awkwardly, they all ended the call. This object was still hovering there, and after about a total of 20 minutes, this object, without warning, suddenly just winked out. They did not see it move away. It did not slowly fade away. Suddenly it was there, and then it wasn't. In a split second, it was gone. So this ended their dinner party, and Joy and Tom said goodbye to Emily and drove nervously home. As Joy says, my husband and I were both pretty shaken up by watching it because it was just so strange. And Tom agrees. As Tom says, that's why we're still talking about it years later. Emily was still upset, and she refused to discuss it ever again. Joy, however, could not let the experience go. She knew it was an important case, a very unusual case. She wanted people to know about it, and that there were strange objects hiding in Monterey Bay, which Joy pointed out is known for having some very deep trenches. In fact, it's the deepest trench along the North American coast. It's quite deep, in fact. Joy called the local radio station, and they told her that they had not received any reports. She called Linda Moulton Howe some years later and shared the sighting with her, and actually also made a report to MUFON. 20 years after the incident, 2018, she submitted a written report to MUFON. Unknown to Joy, however, that was not the only sighting that had taken place at Moss Landing. In fact, Moss Landing had encounters both before and after the incident that Joy, her husband Tom, and Emily observed. So 5 years earlier, in fact, one evening around 10 p.m. in November of 1992, a former U.S. Army officer who was anonymous was working as a security supervisor. He was on patrol and driving by the power plant. And as this officer says, and I quote, "As I approached the Moss Landing Bridge, I saw a flash above the power plant's east cooling tower. I pulled off the road on the north side of the bridge. I exited the car and observed a blue-white orb. It traveled at a uniform height of 100 feet, or about 20 feet above the tower. As the orb passed over the towers, there was a series of 3 bursts that came from the orb. Something fell from the orb, trailing white smoke. The object moved due west out over the ocean through a clear, starry sky until it vanished from sight." The officer continued on his patrol when about 1 hour later, he was again approaching the power plant when he saw yet another glowing orb. As he says, "I saw a blue-white orb about the size of a basketball moving due east at about 100 feet. It was coming in from the ocean at about 30 miles per hour. He watched it move inland towards the south and disappeared." And that night, he says, the local radio station did receive a number of reports of UFOs, but discounted them as meteorites. But it's clear from this officer's description that what he was observing, at least, were not meteorites. And there were still more sightings. It was actually several years later, and after Joy and Tom Williams' sighting, that there was another encounter at Moss Landing. This was on Thanksgiving Day 2006. 2 friends were walking along the beach at Moss Landing, and as one of them says, and I quote them directly, "I noticed an oval white light in the sky near the power plant. Shortly after, I saw the same object about a mile offshore. I watched it appear suddenly, remain stationary for a few seconds, then zip up and over a few hundred yards, and then again in the other direction. It disappeared suddenly, then reappeared further away. This witness happened to be a photographer and quickly got his camera ready and snapped a couple of photos, which I was not able to get a hold of, unfortunately. But as the witness says, it appears on the photos and negatives very clearly and is not a camera or developing error. So there's something about this power plant that is attracting UFOs or USOs. And certainly this is not unique. UFOs are known for hovering over power plants. But in this particular case, it's quite dramatic and ongoing. And in fact, there were more encounters. It was 5 years later, on January 28th, 2011, when there was another witness to an encounter in this same area. A woman was shopping at a store in nearby Watsonville when she saw two orbs several thousand feet high, glowing with about 10 times the brilliance of Venus, she said, so quite bright. Both orbs slowly faded, she says, and moved out towards the ocean, and she estimates that these objects were hovering, get this, directly over Moss Landing. And there's yet another sighting. Just a few years later, 4 years later, in July of 2015, several witnesses observed multiple glowing red orbs about 5 miles off the coast of Moss Landing. The objects hovered and were moving about in the same general area for more than an hour. At one point, they noticed one of these objects emitting beams of light towards the ocean. And as the witness says, and I quote, "It appears as though the ocean's surface was being illuminated by a moving floodlight." So clearly there is something going on here. Is the Moss Landing power plant attracting UFOs? Yeah, I think it probably is, because it wouldn't be the first such case like this. And as I mentioned earlier, there are many other cases in which UFOs have been attracted to, say, nuclear power stations, copper smelting plants, factories, dams, and other power plants. But what makes this case so bizarre and unique is the fact that it came up out of the water, for one thing, and that it had this huge arm that came out of the object, on the end of which was this gigantic pair of pincers, which was scratching on the inside of the smokestacks. So I'm guessing, I'm purely speculating here, that it was taking material to measure the pollution or whatever was coming out of these smokestacks, because this does seem to be one of the UFO occupants' main concerns, is our disregard for Earth's environment and the way we are polluting our planet. This is something they warn many, many contactees about. So perhaps that's what they were doing, just measuring the levels of pollution coming out of the Moss coal power plant. So whatever this thing was, Joy and Tom Williams are absolutely convinced that this was a genuine USO or UFO. As Joy says, and I quote, "This happened, but we're no closer to knowing what they are than we were 40 years ago." So again, the full accounting of this case appears in my brand new book, Wondrous, 25 True UFO Encounters. The book contains many other really unusual cases, but I really wanted to share this case because it is just so strange, so unusual, and one of the most bizarre, really USO cases I have ever researched. So that's the end of this little presentation. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you learned something a little bit more about UFOs and USOs and these strange visitors to our planet. I want to thank you all for watching. I really appreciate it. And until next time, keep having fun.